By subjugating Ukraine, Putin hopes to reassert Russia's status as a great power, discourage other neighbours from pivoting west, and distract from domestic issues through nationalistic fervour. Ultimately, Putin fears the erosion of Russia's imperial legacy and the contagion of democratic aspirations among his own people, making Ukraine not just a strategic interest, but an existential concern for his rule and survival. In other words, he will not stop unless stopped. We're going to unpack this and many other issues. And I'm extremely honoured to be joined once again by Keir Giles, who has spent his career watching, studying, and trying to explain Russia and doing, rather a good job of it, actually, which we're very grateful for. Keir's work has appeared in a wide range of academic and military publications across Europe and in North America, and is a regular contributor and commentator on Russian affairs for international print and broadcast media, and is a senior consulting fellow at UK's Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House. And if you enjoy this conversation, please go back and look at our previous conversations. There is an awful lot to unpack there. A quick thank you to everybody who has helped this channel to exist and helped to help us to fund the sort of journeys and events we've been putting on. As many of you know, there's another one coming up at the Lviv Media Forum and in Kiev and in Odessa coming up, kicking off from next week onwards. So thank you everyone who's gone on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee and all the rest to help us do these kind of things. Yeah, I'm delighted to welcome you back.
Hello again, Jonathan.
Always a huge pleasure. Always feel that there's a million other questions we could throw at you, but let's start off with the big one here, Putin's endgame. Is it just Ukraine, or is it the world order, or is it about prolonging his regime and his life, or is it all of these combined?
I'm really glad you added that last option, because so often we get posed these questions. Is Russia aiming for this or that, as though they're mutually exclusive? But no, of course they're not. All of those things overlap. And yes, if you think about the way in which Putin has framed the conflict with Ukraine, and the explanation in particular that he gave to Russians before launching the full-scale invasion, this program for rewriting the borders of Eastern Europe, or correcting the borders of Eastern Europe, as Putin has it, correcting those historic strategic mistakes that he referred to that caused those lines on the map that we see today to be laid down 100 years ago. If you think that that is limited only to Ukraine, then you have to assume that the rest of the countries of Eastern Europe that were once part of the Russian Empire for some reason get a pass. But that doesn't appear to be the way that Western intelligence and military intelligence services are assessing Russia is going. They are all talking still about preparations by Russia to move against other European countries when they feel the time is right.
So we've got the end game there. And of course, until now, we've had a degree of consensus, at least amongst NATO and the allies. You could say that perhaps consensus tends towards a lowest common denominator of support, what's realistic rather than what's required. Now we see the US negotiators have, lock, stock and barrel, adopted many, if not most, of Russia's aims as their first principles for the talks that have taken place. Now, technically, they say they've withdrawn from those, but do you still fear that Russian narratives, Russian objectives still form the core of sort of talking points within Washington?
Well, that seems fairly plain. I don't think that's in any doubt whatsoever. Whenever you hear a description of the situation with Russia from one of the senior figures in the current administration, it is precisely the picture that you get from Moscow as well. That in itself is a given. It's not something that we need to debate at any great length, because it's a simple fact. The question, however, is what the United States is actually planning to do about it. And that's the problem that we've had ever since these first intimations that the Trump administration had got bored of the attempts to bring an end to the fighting in Ukraine and was looking at walking away. What exactly that walking away entails is crucial. If it is simply that they're going to stop trying to transmit Russia's surrender demands to Ukraine and force them on Ukraine, then this is a good thing. If, on the other hand, it means once again cutting all support to Ukraine to resist Russia's attack, then that's a bad thing. And there are all kinds of permutations in between. But as so often, we need to sit and wait and see what the difference is between what the White House has said and what it is actually going to do.
And normalization is obviously a weakness of the media and indeed, politicians. But sometimes, analysts, not your good self, of course, can be prone to, trying to over-rationalize or normalize the situation. If we try to divide the signal from the noise coming out of the Trump regime, isn't the underlying theme still illiberalism, intolerance, and even coercion of not just adversaries, but allies as well? So even though there might be some sort of positive noises, or let's say slightly more rational noises coming out of the mouths of J.D. Vance and so on, the underlying theme is still things that should give us great cause for concern.
Well, as you know, I'm a Russia expert, not a US expert, but the one surprising thing with the current administration in the United States is how useful criminology skills have been in trying to understand what's going on, what the future direction of policy might actually be. Now, as you know, we talked previously about the book I wrote last year, Who Will Defend Europe, and the direction that the United States was already taking. Let's not pretend that a lot of the surprises, apparent surprises for Europe that have arrived with the Trump administration came out of the blue. There was a long precursor period, and a lot of these problems were not invented by Trump. It's just a long-standing aspiration of the United States to prioritize other challenges around the world over Europe and to put the burden of defending Europe on European shoulders where it rightfully should be. Now, the parts we didn't anticipate, of course, were the other parts that went along with that, the internal turmoil that the United States has been thrown into with the successive attempts at destroying elements of the federal government and, of course, picking meaningless fights with neighbors. That wasn't on the bingo card, but it was plain a year ago that the situation was already challenging for Europe in particular, and something needed to be done about it. And that situation would become more urgent as soon as a Trump administration arrived. That's where we are now. What we don't see is any meaningful response by Western European powers to actually deal with this new situation.
And something that possibly, probably, has not come as a surprise to you, but to many seems to have raised eyebrows, is this pivot from calling the US, fascistic, etc., on the part of Russian propagandists and so on. Ukraine, of course, they've been doing that for some time. Now, apparently, we've got this phenomenon of Eurofascism. We're all Nazis now in Europe, and certainly from Peskov and others, there's this. Agenda clearly. How does that translate into their sort of geopolitical and indeed sort of offensive mantras and doctrine?
Well, it's all absolutely standard. It's part of the course. If Russia picks an enemy, then it describes them as fascists and Nazis. This is something that we've seen evolving over time. After all, there was a period during which the Baltic states were the fascist poster children. Then it was Ukraine. Now it's Europe in general. It's simply the information preparation for actually starting an overt conflict and selling that conflict to the Russian people. It's normal Russian practice, and as you said, we should not be surprised.
Not everyone's taken in by this. I mean, recently I passed through Poland, and I was in the company of some ex-military Poles, some of whom have had, relatives in the 30s and 40s who actually survived gulags. So there seems to be far less. I would say there's no surprise whatsoever, but there's a far deeper understanding of the Russian mentality and the Russian playbook that you've written extensively about. How would you characterize the state of military deterrence and readiness in Europe, especially with this concept of west of Warsaw, east of Warsaw, and this sort of yes, the deep divide in terms of understanding of Russia, its behavior, the mechanics behind its violence and aggression?
Well, there too, nothing has changed. We're still in exactly this situation that we were in 2, 3, 5 years ago, where those countries that are directly exposed to the Russian threat, the frontline states, understand what is at stake and are therefore doing something about it. You mentioned Poland. I was in Warsaw yesterday having one of those conversations about why Poland understands what is at stake. One of those conversations with an older gentleman, a professor who said that he was the first person in his family, as far as records went, who had survived to adulthood actually having a living father because all the rest had been killed by the Russians, and so on. We know all of these stories. We know why these countries, with their living memory of domination by Moscow, are so determined that it should not happen again. But that dividing line is still there. That west of Warsaw, the phrase you used, and the phrase I probably overused in the book, Who Will Defend Europe? But it is despite being slightly unfair to Norway, it is such a clear dividing line between those countries that are addressing the problem and those that are still in a state of somnolence and still hoping that it's actually going to affect somebody else, and therefore not undertaking the kind of transformative investment in defense, transformation of society, everything that's needed to withstand the threat that's coming.
You've written that Russia has the capability and intent, or at least I think you retweeted it, to attack British interests, whether that's mainland or overseas territories. And of course, if you listen to Russian propagandists, they do seem to have a mixture of admiration and loathing, perhaps an overestimation of our military capabilities that harks back to another era. They even termed us, I think, the main bastards was one of the epithets applied to us. But when you're here, and I'm here in a defense conference, our esteemed leader is downstairs talking about the issues of defense. You get a radically different picture that we don't necessarily understand the full threat posed by Russia, and we don't really have a plan to deal with it. So you've written about the defense of Europe. The defense of UK surely is also an intrinsic part of not just supporting Ukraine, but supporting Europe as well.
Well, it is mildly interesting to hear what Keir Starmer will say today at this conference that you have been invited to, but I haven't. So please do fill me in later on whether he actually says anything useful.
I'm
But
not
yes,
not bragging, not in no way.
but yes, it's. I also wrote a piece for the Independent newspaper here in the UK that was published yesterday morning as well about the direct threat to the UK and why it has been underestimated in general by people who could be excused for underestimating it because there's no obvious reason for most people why Russia would attack the UK, but also by a negligent succession of governments that have absolutely refused to put in place not only defenses against any potential Russian hostile action, but also means of mitigating the impact of that action. The civil defense system that is so strong and so resilient in so many frontline states is completely non-existent in the UK, for example. And the problem is that makes the UK not only a soft target, but also a tempting target, because the damage that you can do through any one of these means of delivering damage at extremely long ranges that Russia has been practicing so hard and investing in so much is augmented by the fact that the country is not prepared to deal with it. When people look at a map, they can be forgiven for thinking sometimes that the threat is fairly remote. There's much of Europe in between us and the problem coming from Russia. But the sad and unfortunate fact that we continue to have to point out is that the world, unfortunately, is not flat. And if you look at a globe, you can see very clearly why Russian bomber pilots have been practicing flying around the top of Norway, as they call it, Zaugel, to get into missile launch range of the UK, which, let's not forget, is not an aircraft overhead. It's an aircraft up beyond the Faroe Islands. It's up in the Norwegian Sea. It is at ranges of thousands of kilometers. And this is something for which the UK is entirely unprepared. And it'll be interesting to see if there are any noises coming out of official statements around this defense conference that you're at that actually suggest an interest might be taken in doing something about it.
I mean, I've been here an hour and already I've heard 2.5%, 3% GDP discussed endlessly. And I expect to hear an awful lot more. I haven't heard, and this is the question I'm going to be posing, whether any of this offers a real deterrent. So rather than marking our own homework, which it seems that many of these exercises are, if we are reviewing defense, surely our primary consideration is, do the Russians believe it? Not do our bean counters believe it?
That's right. It comes to a fundamental problem with assessing defense by percentage of GDP. That's a conversation that might have been relevant a decade ago when those targets for NATO spending were first put in place, not to measure actual meaningful defense capability, but really just as a badge of shame for those countries that weren't coming up to scratch. And the fact that 10 years later, some of those countries still aren't doing so showed that shame isn't really an incentive for getting countries to spend on their own defense. What's far more important now is not the input side, it's actually what you buy with it. It's the output. It's where is that defense investment actually going to go, and is it relevant for today's situation? And that's why people are looking for announcements on, for example, integrated air and missile defense for the UK to let the UK not be a wide open target for Russian coercion or deterrence, or any of the other means in which the UK might actually be able to make itself relevant to defense of Europe with or without the cooperation of the United States.
That's a really useful segue to what was going to be the next question. And this is another event that in this case I wasn't at that, but I have, as you have seen, General Zelensky last year at Chatham House give an excellent address. It's interesting looking at his words because, of course, he uses relatively diplomatic language, but the meaning behind is incredibly forceful. And what he suggested in his most recent article is that not only are our armies and our equipment, but our entire procurement process essentially redundant on land, in the air, and on water. And I don't know if you have the impression that whether there's a fundamental rethink of all of these things, or whether we are still in the mindset of fighting the last war.
Well, here in the UK, we simply won't know. There is a strategic defense review underway, as you know, which is supposedly going to report back sometime soon. That may make recommendations, and then the government may or may not actually seek to act on those recommendations. All of these are open questions. But there's an even more fundamental challenge to the way procurement works and even the way the armed forces are structured and their doctrine and their strategy. And that is this long-standing assumption, not just in the UK, but in a range of Western European countries, that they would only ever fight a war as part of a coalition, and the United States would be the backbone of that coalition. Now, there are two options for dealing with the current situation: either to hope that the United States will in fact be there, despite having said very clearly that it does not intend to be for operations like, for example, a reinsurance force for Ukraine, or to hope that there will be elections in the United States after 3 and a bit years, and there will be a change of attitude from the White House after them, or to actually recognize that this forces a fundamental reassessment of how defense is structured and organized for many countries that previously had absolutely relied on the United States.
We've previously discussed sort of Moscow rules, and to anyone who hasn't read it, I recommend that as the starting point for any understanding of Russia. Then possibly go and read Marcus de Custine after that, and then there's probably not much else you need to read. Um, is Putin following the classic sort of Moscow rules playbook, or given his obsession with regime and personal survival and his sort of quasi KGB sort of mafia roots, is this a sort of non-classical Moscow rules? Because he seems to have wrung out of the US an extraordinary set of concessions. By definition, things you didn't have before, but which you've been able to sort of wangle. And he's rejected those, flatly rejected those, thrown them back in the face of the US. Does this smack of hubris or desperation in that he cannot end the war because of the type of regime he's constructed? Or are we still following the classic Moscow rules playbook?
Well, again, the either-or questions don't always work. In this case, it can be both the same. Now, that book you're referring to, Moscow Rules, the subtitle was "What Drives Russia to Confront the West?" And it was about how Russia always confronts the West throughout history, and how this is actually driven by some of the historical and geographical and social realities within Russia itself. With that in mind, there will never be a time when Russia thinks that all of these overtures that are being made by the United States, all of the gifts that are being handed to Moscow, actually mean that there is less enmity and less cause for conflict between Russia and the West. Now, in this case, it may possibly have been a miscalculation by Putin, not seizing on what was being offered as the opportunity that so many people thought he was looking for to freeze the conflict, to cement in place those gains that Russia has made, and to take a breathing space in order to reconstitute Russia's armed forces faster for the next move. Now, Putin may be receiving accurate and correct and sensible advice on when is the right time to freeze the conflict, or he may not. But it's clear that the assessment has been that it's better for them to push on than to pocket the gains that the United States was so keen to hand to them.
And speaking to people, again, not yourself and the esteemed experts of Chatham House, but a lot of people who I listen to seem to swing wildly between, Russia's going to overtake Europe. We're living in 1939, etc. on the one extreme, and on the other, well, Russia's completely incapable. It doesn't have the forces. Its equipment has been annihilated. Absolutely, this is overblown. And this is just our military-industrial complex trying to whip up fear to create a quick buck. I think the perspective of Ukrainian servicemen is useful, and having recently come back from the east, I think their main message is don't underestimate Russia because technology has changed. And currently, the two most advanced militaries in the world are Russia and Ukraine. And that is continuing day by day, hour by hour. What's your view on this and the sort of balance we should be taking? Or where is the threat likely to come? Is it more traditional, conventional warfare, big set piece invasion, or is it perhaps more pernicious?
Well, you're right, of course, that the estimates of Russian military power have swung wildly between extremes, swung between massive overestimation and massive underestimation, and finding the balance in between them that is reality-based is a challenge that seems to elude some of the most prolific public commentators. We've seen that happen a couple of times already just in the course of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The expectation that the Russian military would be a steamroller, that Ukraine would be unable to resist before the invasion, switching to an assumption that the Russian military was once again broken and incapable just a few short weeks or months after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and that sine wave has more or less continued as we've had Russian military successes and setbacks in the 3 years since then. But the real problem, of course, is the way in which the Russian military is developing, and Ukraine alongside it, away from the traditional metrics of military power that most countries thought were essential for actually withstanding Russia. We've seen the validation of some of the old technologies that were vital for warfighting in the past. We've seen the introduction of new ones. We've seen the meshing, the blending of them into what some of our colleagues call a Mad Max form of warfare, where low tech and high tech go together to deliver effect. But coming back to the end of your question there, what exactly is the threat? Once again, we have to remember it's not an either or. Russia is prepared for full-scale military invasions. It is also prepared for pernicious means of covert or clandestine causing damage across the continent. This probing and testing campaign for arson, sabotage, and assassination that we've seen also going in peaks and troughs throughout the last 2 years is preparation for doing something. If Russia thinks that it is more effective to do something covert or clandestine than it is to roll tanks or whatever they might be riding in these days across the border. So the options are always open. And when we're talking about that long-range coercion, when we're talking about the way in which Russia might seek to achieve political objectives, not against the frontline states, but against those targets further afield that may be softer and may be more effective in terms of bringing about political outcomes, we need to think of that whole spectrum. Now, the article that I mentioned that I wrote for The Independent was published yesterday was about the potential primarily for missile strikes on the UK, but that's not the only way that Russia has been practicing delivering damage. If any of the isolated attacks that we've seen across Europe, whether it's cyber, whether it's arson, whether it's sabotage or logistics, if they came together as a mass coordinated campaign, then the impact would be devastating and would be comparable with an actual direct demonstrative strike.
And another aspect interests me. If you look at sort of Putin and his not just his KGB background, but also the art of karate, or the Russian version Systema. You use your opponent's weight against them, even if you're much smaller and diminutive, as of course Putin is. Um, and this great quote that you shared was the Russia has achieved many of its strategic aims by actually exploiting the Western obsession with ending conflict. And this comes back perhaps to the weakness of democracy, the indecision of democracy, and our tendency to try and look forward optimistically towards progress, and perhaps not understand the malignancy with which Russia fights. Um, this desire also to avoid conflict. Do you see Russia continuing to sort of use this and manipulate that desire in us, as well as, administrative and political inertia?
Well, as ever, Russia will continue adopting a given tactic for as long as it delivers success, and it has consistently delivered success. There are a lot of elements of that syndrome that you described, where Western powers look for a means of ending the conflict with optimism, as opposed to Russia that just wants to win the war. Many different ways in which that affects ceasefire negotiations, affects the outcomes of ceasefires. But what Russia has consistently seen is that they can exploit that process by dictating negotiating the terms of ceasefires and making sure that that Western drive to end the fighting at more or less any cost is turned to Russia's advantage. And that's the reason why in the period before the arrival of Donald Trump in the White House, a ceasefire in Ukraine without any security guarantees was considered one of the worst case outcomes, precisely because it would allow Russia to cement those gains and reconstitute its forces faster without Ukraine eroding or retreating them. Now, because of the shifts in US policy, that's no longer one of the worst possible outcomes. It's been catapulted somewhere into the middle of the field, and Ukraine has been induced to adopt this through the pressure that's come from the United States. But the problem still remains. Any ceasefire on Russian terms, as we've seen so many times before, even if it appears equitable to the Western power that is imposing it, tends to leave Russia with freedom of movement and freedom to exploit the arrangements in any way that it can, simply because the spirit of the ceasefire agreement does not accord with the letter of it.
And you say, we will seek to avoid conflict at any cost. Russia seems to be the reverse. It will seek to perpetuate war despite the cost, at any cost as well. Now, I know you're not an expert on Russian internal politics, so I'm going to try and link this one, of course, to their aggressive foreign policy. But it does seem that Putin is still intent, in fact, accelerating the transformation of Russia into a quasi-Soviet gulag. And that includes militarization of education, the media, and various other aspects of the economy, and including Russia's largest company now by volume, I believe, is Rostec, is mate Chemezov's enterprise. So it seems there's no rowing back, rather there's an acceleration into militarization. Surely you would not do that unless you intended in some ways to use that.
Of course, this is one of the factors that is feeding into these assessments across Europe and under the previous administration in the United States as well, that Russia is preparing for a direct confrontation with the West, including potentially moving against a NATO nation. We shouldn't overstate the extent to which Russia has turned back into the Soviet Union. Yes, you're absolutely right. The direction of travel has been clear for some time, and that direction of travel is accelerating back towards the past in so many ways that are deeply familiar to people who have looked at the USSR or lived in it before. But there's a long way to go before we hit rock bottom. There's a long way to go before we get back to that Stalinist totalitarian approach, despite the fact that Russia is transforming itself, like the Soviet Union, not into a country with a war machine, but a country that is a war machine. Despite the fact that repression light is still gathering force, they don't as yet have gulags. They don't as yet have that unrestrained, totalitarian, aggressive, total failure of guardrails that we had from the Stalinist regime. Yes, that is where things are going, but things can get a lot worse yet.
It's an interesting point. I don't want to end on this. One little point to end on, but in talking to Panvarov and indeed a Russian chap who's in Kazakhstan, sorry, Uzbekistan, I think it's interesting. The idea that we're going to see a sort of classic Stalinist model and a gulag and so on, that perhaps blinds us to what's happening in plain sight. He's outsourced the gulag to Eastern Ukraine. If he wants to get rid of someone, he's already got somewhere to send them, which they will not return from. And you don't have to build gulags if Russia becomes an entire gulag. And this Russian chap was making the point that soon they will potentially freeze bank accounts, and they're talking about converting private bank accounts into exchange for shares in this militarized economy. Almost a third, serfdom 3.0. Do you see any use in sort of looking at it like that, or looking beyond the Stalinist sort of tropes and templates to a different form of autocracy that's unfolding?
Well, the aims are the same, but of course the methods evolve. And that's similar to comparing the forms of repression during those periods of the 20th century, where the Soviet Union was not full-on Stalinist, with what happened under Tsarist times. The fundamental aims and objectives of how Russia wanted to stifle political dissent and make itself an effective war machine remain constant, but the methodology changes over time. So we shouldn't necessarily be surprised that we may not see a precise carbon copy replica of even Khrushchev's time or Brezhnev's, let alone Stalin. The way in which these methods are enforced against people within the country, though, I think doesn't necessarily preclude those kinds of mass arrest that you're talking about. And I take issue with the idea that you don't need to construct gulags if the country as a whole is a gulag, because then there would have been no gulags in the Soviet Union. I think that analogy doesn't quite work, but we shouldn't be surprised if things are modernized in terms of the way Russia actually goes about achieving its aims.
The last question then, and as you know, this defence review is unfolding, this seems kind of pertinent. Rather than us murking our own homework and leaving it up to bean counters to decide whether 2.5%, etc., is enough or not, sort of the ultimate deterrent, the ultimate test, rather, of whether our defense review is working is whether the Russians take it seriously, whether they react or adapt, or in any way see it as a threat or a deterrent. Do you see any likelihood that our defense industry and our defense policymakers and analysts are going to start looking at the other end of the telescope? Is it working, rather than, focusing it from a very, let's say, administrative, managerial point of view?
I'm afraid that's wild speculation. I don't know what's in the defense review. I know what I and colleagues contributed to it, which certainly would take the attitude you're describing. What is actually relevant to influencing the challenges that we face? Whether that will survive into the final draft, I'm afraid there's no way of knowing at this point.
And we have to wait and see. The last one, I'm going to do an episode on closing the sky. In Britain's current state of military readiness or unreadiness, what can we offer Ukraine by way of trying to secure its freedom? Is boots on the ground at all realistic, or is closing the sky with some form of sky shield a better option, or do both of those present significant challenges?
Well, apparently both of those do present significant challenges, and we can see that in the way that the British rhetoric about being present in Ukraine has developed over a relatively quick space of time after it was first raised by Keir Starmer. Less than 48 hours between saying, yes, of course, the UK must be present in Ukraine, and it must lead this, at the time it was still being referred to as a peacekeeping force, to actually, no, we can't do this without the Americans. And of course, the United States, as we mentioned earlier, has made it very clear that it does not wish to be involved. Now, what that implies is that for the UK and potentially for other European militaries as well, the absence of US support means that they are not able to fulfill their primary function, because they cannot be somewhere where Russia doesn't want them to be and expect to survive. That, of course, means that there is a deeper strategic choice to be made. If you cannot defend forward in Ukraine because your forces are so incapable after 30 years of cuts that they cannot actually survive there, where can you defend against the Russian threats, and where can you draw the line?
Absolutely. Realistic questions rather than optimistic ones. Here, it's been a huge, huge pleasure, as always, speaking to you. I know the audience massively appreciates your insights into this. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next occasion.
My pleasure. Enjoy the conference.